How's it going, guys? Well, we're on part 11 now, and today we're going to be covering basically the Breakout and the Trail of Blood segment right up until they come across President Shinra's dead body. And, yeah, it's actually really short on both these guys' parts. Chapter 11 in Gallagher's work is pretty short, and Williams covers this in about 10 pages. So, hopefully, this is a bit shorter than my usual episodes. So, let's get started. So, with Gallagher's work, we open up with a brief bit of that internal conversation, just like in the game, before we wake up into a prison scene. Now, if you're wondering why I always start with a Gallagher description, it is because he habitually begins his chapters with a wonderful setting description. Williams has a tendency to start his chapters kind of in the middle of a scene or a conversation or bounce from point to point to point very quickly. And this is partly due to the fact that his chapters are a lot smaller and have a lot more going on between them. Again, both styles can work, but I feel like if you're going to do it like Gallagher, where you have long chapters, you really do need to open up with that heavy, establishing shot, if you will. Anyways, we're going to start from page 191. Here's a quote. Using the slimy toilet bowl as a support, Cloud pulled himself uneasily to his feet. The single filament bulb atop the sealed doorway buzzed as he started to pace the room, its red light flickering as it traced his circular path. Peering through the barred grating on the door as he passed, he watched the armed sentry tap the butt of his rifle repetitively against an adjacent cell. The situation seemed surreal to him, as if it were no less of a dream than the strange voice in his head. His tense mind began to filter the events of the previous weeks, trying desperately to form any pattern or meaning. The bombings, avalanche, his very presence in the city. Why am I here? How did I even get to this point? With the pulsing thoughts and questions flooding his brain, it was almost a minute before he realized he was no longer upright, his arms swinging by his side, squatting so that his knees now touched his abdomen. He found that he had subconsciously returned to his old soldier technique for dealing with stress. What am I doing? Get a grip, Cloud. So then we get a hilarious and awkward bit of off-color comedy after this, with Red 13 cleaning himself, which Barrett finds uncomfortable. Red asks him if he's offering to help. It's funny, it's crude, it oddly kind of fits the setting, and I like it. I do like those random humor moments, and you can squeeze them in. I've mentioned them often, but it's true, I like those. This leads to a conversation about Bugenhagen. Now, Barrett and Red are talking about Shinra's plans to use Aerith and the Ancients to find the Promised Land, and Red mentions that his grandfather had told them all about the Ancients. This is a clever way to include that somewhat out-of-place line from the game, where it just seems like he's sort of pining for his grandfather, he randomly saying grandfather, and Barrett starts laughing. This is something that both authors actually do well here, and I think it's essential for somebody attempting their own novelizations. Sometimes games do things that make sense in the game world, but don't make sense in a narrative. And you have to include it without having it compromise your own work. I'm getting better at it, but I think Gallagher and Williams are both masters at it. The conversation ends by Barrett asking Red for help with Avalanche, and Red basically telling him, yeah, I'm all for preservation, but now's not the time. Red is probably the most pragmatic member of the group on that subject. This also kind of ties into the underlying message of, hey, Avalanche may be on the right side, but they're also eco-terrorists. This will come up a little bit later, too. We then have a touching conversation between Tifa, Aerith, and Cloud as they commiserate over the general failure of their plan to save her, but that's not where the most of the tension in the scene comes from. Aerith asks point-blank if they are with Avalanche. You see, she had some run-ins with the previous group who wanted to use her as a weapon. That's another compilation nod for those of you keeping score at home. Interestingly, Sung, who you would think have motivation to lie here, told her that, well, they're not exactly the same Avalanche, but, they're still Avalanche. Although he did tell her that, you should still stay away from them. So, this is a moment of emotional confusion here, for Aerith, who is, in spite of everything, seeming to regard Sung as trustworthy, or at least she values his opinion. Because to her, when she was a kid, apparently while he was scary, there was still kind of a... She understood he was there to protect him. It's one of those things that I gotta admit, I never got. This is the one part of their relationship that I really struggle with fully understanding. I really need to play Crisis Core more to better understand that. But yeah, it creates a great deal of tension here. And Aerith eventually decides that, okay, I guess you're not quite the same, but again, between her and Red, there's definitely a lot of wariness about wanting to be out-and-out affiliated with Avalanche. And now for my next quote here, let's have Aerith explain her backstory to you. This is from page 195 and 196. My earliest memories are spending all my days locked in a room like this with my real mom. We would have regular visits from different strange scientists, especially Professor Hojo. Although he was always performing tests on us, I think he found a certain attachment to us, or to my mom at least. I can remember he once told her about a fellow scientist he had loved and married a long time ago, but his arrogance and allegiance to his work had prevented him from ever telling her how he really felt. I suppose, deep down, he regrets losing her, and grown bitter because of it. Anyway, there was one scientist called Professor Raijincho, who often spent time with us. He was a nice man, and had very strong views on the way of the world. He made no secret to us of his disapproval at what Shinra were doing with me and Mum. He came to visit us one evening after Mum had gone through a difficult experiment, and gave her something for the pain. I'll never know if it was deliberate or not, but he left the cell door unlocked. We escaped that night, my mum weaker than I'd ever seen her, and managed to get as far as the slums. All I can remember is forever looking up at the distant black sky. Well, what would have been the underside of the plate, of course. I'm not sure if she had been ill, or whether the experiment had taken its toll on her, but Mum never made it further than the train station. I believe her only aim was to make sure I was safe before she returned to the planet. The backstory comes out all at once here and packs a huge punch. We get a lot of information thrown at us at once, and the effect is quite staggering. Particularly interesting to me is the hint at Hojo's lost love, and the possibility that he might have actually had some affection for Lucretia, which, pay attention guys, that's going to come up later when we talk about the Nibelheim incident. Aerith recites a bit of ancient wisdom for the group. I guess since they're in jail, this would be called slammer poetry. I'm sorry. It's a nice little prophecy, though. Beautiful, but ominous. Like a friend request from a hot girl you don't recognize. I do like the expansion of an idea here by Gallagher. He refers to the Cetra as geomancers. Now, geomancy has a long, storied history in Final Fantasy, so it's a nice touch. Speaking of the eco-terrorist angle I told you to come back, we have Cloud dream of Jesse's final words, as if to punctuate the idea. Gallagher is planting these seeds in our head that Avalanche may not be the greatest approach in the same chapter that Red expresses his hesitance at joining you. I'm telling you, this guy crafts the hell out of his foreshadowing. So Cloud awakes, and we, of course, see the gruesome trail of blood. After a bone-chilling paragraph describing the carnage of the poor infantrymen, worthy of any solid creepypasta, we then have Cloud break the mood immediately by a flippant comeback. Tifa asks if the guard was murdered, and Cloud said, well, he certainly didn't do that to himself. The no shit Sherlock is subtextual. Also, I have to point this out, when Cloud grabs the keys to let the others out, he of course has to say, come with me. And all I can think is the Terminator. Come with me if you... I can't do it because I'm sick. Oh man, I had this whole bit written out where I was going to do Arnold, Arnold impressions, and it was going to be really annoying, but my throat hurts, and now I can't do it. I think... Let me try. Come with me. I can't do it. It's too gravelly. Oh! I hate when you write a bit intending your voice to be working and your voice doesn't work. Put that cookie down! Okay, whatever. Anyway. So, dumb joke aside, moving on. One thing here. Red comments on how precisely the soldier was killed. And with a blade, no less. The precision is particularly highlighted. Now, I'm not an expert in stab wounds, But you just painted a gory picture of a man who went full Tauntaun, with Cloud actually having to step through his intestines. And then you specifically highlight precision. I get what the attempt here was. Red is smart and can identify a wound, and Sephiroth is a master swordsman. But if it were me, I would really focus more on the brutality of it, and focus less on the precision. Maybe I'm splitting hairs. I didn't mean that to be a pun, but it actually kind of is. And while we're talking about carnage, I'm more of a Venom guy myself, let's have another quote. This will be our last one. Page 200. Talking about spooky right now. Cloud led them warily from the cell block, their hastened steps reverberating along the narrow passage. The lamps of the corridor had been dimmed, causing the plastic walls to glimmer in the faint blue light cast by the bulb above a twin set of electronic doors at its end, deliberately rendering only the Shinra diamond across them visible from the prison. Arriving at the doorway, they drew to a halt, Cloud raising an arm for the others to hold their positions. Reaching out, he grabbed the panel and slowly pulled, unsurprised that the door offered no resistance as it should to being parted. The scene that awaited them on the other side was worse than he had anticipated. Streaks of deep red had been sprayed across the high windows that lined the junction to the main hallway, the reflection on the glass revealing the slain bodies of the researchers and technicians that lay around the corners, their severed limbs and mutilated figures coated in their own blood. The shadows of the dead danced hauntingly and without order in the trembling light of the Department of Biological and Biochemical Development, as if their souls were desperately trying in vain to leave the world of the living. Ugh. Yeah, you see, you could write horror, my friend. You could totally do it. So, they head to the surveillance room to get their gear back, because video game law requires all prisoner effects to be in an easily accessible crate. The rest of the chapter is mostly soaking up the carnage of the scene, with lovingly crafted paragraphs full of grit and horror, just like the one I just read there, and other wonderful grotesqueries beside. It's a little bit hard on the stomach, if truth be told, but as a lover and writer of horror myself, I found this to be a delightfully macabre chapter to read. It's still one of my favorite sequences in the game, and one of the best music cues in the game too, by the by. They pass by the Jenova chamber, and of course Jenova is gone. Red says that it seems that it was transported upstairs by use of the specimen elevator, this adding a nice little aside to the highlights of the path that were taken by the Trail of Blood. Our heroes follow the path because Cloud needs to know. This sounds like a throwaway line, but I don't think it is. I may be vastly overreaching here. But I'm going to throw in another coin in the Gallagher's foreshadowing tin, because having this line implies that there's a sort of connection between Cloud and Jenova. It hints at the reunion. So, after a few more lovely paragraphs, the chapter ends on the ominous sight of President Shinra, quote-unquote, skewered like an animal. Alrighty then, moving over to Williams' work. I told you it was short. So, Williams covers this section in around 10 pages, and his pages are smaller than Gallagher pages by a bit, so this is going to be especially short. We start on page 248, so let's open with some morbidly funny banter between Red and Barrett here. You like the sound of the book going... Barrett looked at the red fur. It was short, smooth, almost like a lion. On the front left shoulder, 13 was tattooed. It looked brand new, still had blood around the edges. "Is that the number 13? Barrett asked. Red 13 curled into himself and yawned. "What, are you sleepy?" Barrett paced. "We gotta think of a way out of here." "The cells are impenetrable," Red 13 said. "I tried years ago when I was first captured. The wisest thing you can do now is save your strength for when they open the door again." Barrett tried to pull the door, but there was no handle, and his left fingers were bulky and sweaty on the smooth metal. "Come on, Red! The next time they open the door is to shoot us out like pups in a box!" "That is a dreadful simile." Red 13 closed his eyes and slowed his breathing. "Rest your body. If you need to run, you'd better have the strength to get to safety." So, Williams' writing of Nanaki here. I gotta say, and allow me to put this in Reddit cringe terms, Nanaki is very r/I am very smart. I will now read a quote from his with a silly voice. Relatively speaking, I have the highest recorded IQ on the planet, but there is still the possibility, however slim, that a female of my species may exist. In that case, I will appear considerably less impressive. Oof. r/I am very smart and r/white knighting. Joking aside, this leads to an oddly deep conversation about Nanaki using his intelligence to bring out the intelligence in Barrett. I really like this. He basically tells Barrett, stop being so down on yourself. Yes, I'm smart. That doesn't mean you aren't smart too. He then challenges Barrett to explain the situation in his own terms. It's a really nice bonding moment, and it helps show that Nanaki is more down to earth than he might seem. The moral lesson here is that those who are blessed with intelligence display it best when they use it to lift up their fellow man. But then, that's just me being a bit pretentious, so let's just move on. Williams ends the line here by having Nanaki just utter that he just wants to go home and mentioning Grandpa, which in context sounds a lot more sensible. Chapter 28 ends with the three-way convo between Tifa, Eris, and Cloud, and it's pretty by the book. There isn't a whole lot else in terms of dialogue that Williams does differently, but I do like the thought process running through Cloud's mind here during this time, kind of a continuation of the beginning of that section, where he's thinking about, how he got here, and particularly dwelling upon how Hojo had referred to the ancients as a species. It's actually a neat little hint, and foreshadowing, sort of, considering the prior encounter with Hojo, about Eris's ultimate fate. So chapter 29 picks up on page 253, and this section is 4.5 pages from done. So, let's wrap this up. I told you it was pretty damn short. Now to compensate, how about I quote you the opening of this chapter, because it's damn good. He didn't dream. When his mind came around, a few seconds before he regained motor control, he instinctively checked his senses to see if he could perceive danger before being able to open his eyes. He couldn't, and his mind relaxed as his eyelids began to slide open. It was for the best that he hadn't dreamt. These days, the only dreams he had were of the past, and that voice. His eyelids were open. Tifa slept soundly on the cot. It looked like a slab of metal, but she bore it well. She couldn't have become a martial artist without learning how to deal with sleeping on boards. Her sensei, Cloud strained to recall him, Master Zangan, his name was. He probably had his hands full with young Tifa. The door to the cell was open. Not ajar, wide open. Cloud's eyes passed through the doorway, and he checked to see if anyone was outside, coming in, or trying to exit. When he saw no commotion, his dreary mind cast on to checking the corners of the room. Nothing in the corners. They were safe. He realized subconsciously that the door was open. He sprang to his feet, and his vision bleached with dizziness. He ran out of the cell and into the hallway. I'm still asleep, he believed it to the point of happiness. He wasn't dreaming about the past. The other cell doors were closed. The hallway turned abruptly to the left after a few doors. A dead MP slumped in the elbow of the hallway. Cloud landed back in his body. I'm not asleep. He rushed over. The MP wasn't just dead. He had been sliced in two by some razor-thin instrument that hadn't even tapered the edges of his clothing. Whatever had struck this blow, it was sharp and lightning quick. Already Cloud's mind was racing to the most horrifying possible explanations, the worst of which filled him with a hot panic. He needed to wake up Tifa. I'll make a quick nod here to the precision angle again, since I mentioned it in Gallagher's work. Williams describes the precision so perfectly in 3 sentences here. Razor-thin instrument that hadn't even tapered the clothing. Sharp, lightning quick. These are the context words that really help ring home precision to me. Now, random aside here, Williams uses the word equipped. So when he's talking about, Cloud putting back on his armor and sword, he uses the word equipped. Personally, I would have avoided that word. It's very video gamey. Aha! The reviewer giveth, and the reviewer taketh away. He keeps Red's line here about the death, as Red says, No human could have done this. And I like this. I like that approach. I think that line didn't really need to be changed, because it's foreshadowing. I mean, I know that's the word of the day, foreshadowing, but it is. It's foreshadowing. Sephiroth did do this, but the entire question about Sephiroth's identity comes down to that one famous line, "Am I a monster?" Sephiroth believes himself to be a monster before he says, "I'm a god." That's what that was referencing. I really think that was intentional. So Tifa convinces them to follow the trail of blood to find out what's going on. We get another glimpse of the reckless devil-may-care heiress here, who almost gets excited at the idea. A nice little character touch. Okay, so this section ends, yes, ends already, with them coming across Jenova's dome, which has been punched open. Red makes a comment about how Hojo didn't do anything with the specimen, but just, quote, looked at it often. Cloud says the trail heads up, and that's it. There's like a paragraph of travel before we catch up to the end of Gallagher's travel time, so we'll just end it here. Okay, guys, this is it, the penultimate section. Next time is going to be a big one, so it may take me some time to get to you. I'm going to focus more on writing this month anyways, so probably expect it maybe early to mid-March. We will see. Now, the section here was short, as you can tell, so I'm not going to really go majorly into, what's the big comparison point. If I had to choose, we get brief glimpses at how the authors handle, mandatory game moments, but also there's something to be said about comparing how they write gore and horror. And for my money, they both did a good job. Both of them were really good at getting, the creep factor going. And if you can scare somebody with words, that you're doing a good job as a writer. It's easy to have a creepy idea, but to convey it well through writing, that's harder, and I think those guys both did a great job of it. So next time is the finale. I have to say, I didn't think this was gonna go quite as far as it did, but I gotta be honest, it's been a hell of a ride, you guys. Well, as Barrett said, there ain't no getting off of this train we're on. Until we do our Nibelheim Incident Chapters. So, I'm only going to cover 3 chapters today. I'll tell you why at the end. Starting with Chapter 16. Now, this chapter takes us into Cloud's head, and we learn that it was, in fact, Genesis who wounded him. Now, I like the flashback sequence here, and how powerless he writes Cloud. He gets ragdolled by a gravity spell, which is as perfect a magical metaphor as you can get. It's also sad, because Cloud, who had already, if you recall, been dealing with these feelings of inadequacy, has had them thrust into his face rather forcefully. He sinks into a depression here, regretting that he came home without becoming a soldier. It's so heartbreaking, and I feel so bad for Spiky. Zack comes in to let him know that Tifa's okay, and then he tells Cloud that, maybe you shouldn't get involved with Soldier. He even goes so far as to call it a den of monsters. Impressive foreshadowing aside, the conversation then turns back to Tifa and Zack, who is once again the most perpetually uninformed person in the series, asking him, so what's the deal with this Tifa girl? Cloud Facebooks his way out of the conversation, it's complicated, and so Zack hands his phone over to try and show Cloud what he's missing. There's a cute nod to an email from Yuffie, aka the Treasure Princess, that I enjoyed. Anyway, this leads to Cloud having to open up, something he's really bad at. But then I'm one to talk, I have to write squall. This chapter is a perfect example of the little vignettes that you can do when you work into a story. It's actually a style that Williams does a whole lot, and I've noticed Gallagher here has a very similar method in the Nibelheim incident. It's these little side moments that could almost stand alone as a one-shot, that really pack a lot of character punch into a tiny scene. The entire conversation between Zack and Cloud is just adorable, although it definitely turns somber here as Cloud begins to explain some of Tifa's backstory. How Cloud wanted to help her, and how he couldn't, and how he lost control of himself, lost his identity, lost who he was. We can feel that, we can see that, and again, it does kind of tie into what happened later. We're seeing him tell Zack about the seeds of, again, his inadequacy. It's such a humanizing moment. I really love this chapter. Speaking of Zack, Chapter 17 puts us back in his shoes. This starts with a conversation between Zack and Aerith on the phone, which I gotta be honest, really hit me hard. Like, I'm not certain why. Maybe it's my own situation, but, like, that little conversation and that disappointment she felt, just like, wow, really touched me. Like, you never know those little moments that are gonna resound with your readers. Zack then has a little conversation with Zangan, who, in so many words, asks, is your boy Sephiroth about to murder us all? To which Zack replies, no, of course not. Murder is his least favorite thing to do. Llamas with hats, anyone? But the conversation is nice, as it reminds us that despite most of our protagonists working for Shinra, they're still the bad guys, who will make things very difficult for any potential embarrassment. Zack then heads into Shinra Manor with a wonderful page-and-a-half description that Gallagher is famous for. Oh, I wish I was quoting in this. I didn't do it because I don't want to take up more time, but it's really good. And hey, I think I've got reason to believe that this place is going to be pretty important soon. He runs into Heidi, and there's a cute little interaction that I won't spoil, who tells Zack that Sephiroth has basically been chilling out in the archives. Cloud then shows up and leads him to the secret basement level, all while Zack continues to be in denial. Come on, guys, this could be anybody's evil lair. Some of the more fantastic description moments in this chapter actually come from this basement. Again, I was just commending the guy's horror chops a moment ago. Really comes out here. He talks about, the smell of rotting meat and stuff like that. It's just, it's wonderful. So anyway, Zack finally confronts Sephiroth. I mock Zack, but honestly, it's an understandable plight that is in here, trying to come up with any explanation as to why Sephiroth might not be about to do what he's about to do. Because you don't really want to think that your friend and somebody that you love is about to do something terrible. Something I know a bit about myself, actually. Not like destroying a town, but we've all had that friend. We've all been that friend, let's be honest. Anyway, Sephiroth has found documents about the Jenova project and about how Dr. Gast has begun the work, and, well, one thing led to another, and Sephiroth realizes that subjects G, A, and S are Genesis, Angeal, and Sephiroth. As an aside, really, Shinra, that's your code name? Sephiroth asks to be left alone, and the chapter ends. And we get a chapter 18 breather right before everything goes to hell. So let's take a look at chapter 18 real quick. This chapter takes us into Hojo's shoes 2 days later at Junin. We of course get a reference to the Sister Ray as one would expect, but Gallagher also takes some time to detail the strategic importance of Junin, and how it's basically the lifeblood port of the world, which is why Shinra has all of its key naval and aeronautical operations housed here. We then have Reno show up, which is hilarious, because he's not mentioned by name. But we know who he is. We, the reader, know who he is. If the obvious descriptions weren't enough, he always has him go, yo, like I mentioned at the beginning. He throws in that little character trait. They haggle over airships, Hojo asking why they're using the Highwind instead of the Gelnicka, giving us further nods before the conversation ends. That's the least interesting part of the chapter. What's more interesting here is Hojo confirming in his head that he doesn't really care about his pet monsters, because Sephiroth is the far more important prize here. I also love how Hojo views the Turks, and perhaps most people in Shinra, as cockroaches. The comparison comes up frequently during this chapter. What's really interesting here is the internal monologue about his colleagues, first commenting about how Gast always tried to teach him empathy, but Hojo viewed it as something that would hold back his research. And just when Hojo has gone full heartless mastermind, we have a twisted romantic moment where he remembers Lucretia. I'm getting tongue-tied here. He describes her as the lighthouse in his sea of apathy. Beautiful line, very touching, but also incredibly unnerving. It's a sick kind of love. It's the twisted romance of a villain. Lucretia wasn't a romantic partner to him. She was a tool, almost. He may have thought there was a romance between them. He may have believed himself to be in love. But really, he was just using her to better himself and giving nothing back. He was relying upon her as an emotional crutch. She was basically being used to center him and that's not a healthy relationship. There has to be a give and take. It's really, really creepily effective at both humanizing and villainizing him. Okay, so I'm gonna leave things here. The reason is the next 7 chapters are the big moment, and I'd hate to cut off mid-Inferno. So when I do the finale, I'll be covering the last 7 chapters and the epilogue of the Nibelheim Incident, and I really feel like the next one is gonna be monstrously long, so brace yourself. Anyway, I have done my part here. Gotta give my love to my Patreon knights. Of course, Matthew Caveat Zealot, MJ Gallagher, and Robin Berg. Thank you guys so much. I love all of you guys for all the support you have shown me, and for listening to me on this ridiculously long adventure. I will see you next time for the conclusion. Take care.